James Monroe begins not as a doctrine, but as a boy with a musket, a student who left his books at Williamsburg to follow a general across a dark river toward an impossible dawn. Before he was the last of the Virginia dynasty, before editorialists softened the weather of his years into the easy label of an era of good feelings, he was 19, marching with cold feet and an appetite for risk that had not yet learned to call itself duty. He crossed the Delaware with Washington on Christmas night and took a ball through the shoulder at Trenton in the morning light. That wound did not make him a hero. It made him a witness. He saw how resolve feels when rations are low and shoes fail, and the arithmetic of survival becomes a series of small obediences done in hard weather. The soldier became the measure of the statesman he later chose to be. Not a theorist who loved the symmetry of plans more than the stubbornness of facts, but a practitioner who believed that nations are built out of logistics and promises kept under strain. Virginia educated him in law and manners and gave him a circle of older men whose minds would be his weather. Jefferson, with his architectural sentences about liberty and his household that betrayed them. Madison, with his watchmaker's calm, turning friction into form. Monroe learned to speak quietly and to last longer than the men who needed to be overheard. He was not an orator. He was a worker in the prose of public life. He married Elizabeth Courtwright, whose Paris polish would later soften the austerity of his social rooms without teaching him the vanity of performance. He governed Virginia with a planter's familiarity and a lawyer's reluctance to let custom write the law. In the horror surrounding Gabriel's planned revolt, he tried to combine clemency with order, recommending mercy in some cases and allowing executions in others, an ambiguity that reveals a mind unwilling to feed frenzy and yet unable to imagine an immediate justice that would undo the world he inhabited. He owned enslaved people and relied on their labor. He distrusted slavery's morality and feared slavery's politics. He did not dismantle the system that carried him. That contradiction would sit under everything he later did in national office like a low drum. He became a diplomat in a world still discovering whether the United States was a rumor or a regime. In Paris, he arrived as an ambassador with Republican manners and an American appetite for bargains. With Robert Livingston, he faced a Europe rearranging itself at Napoleon's whim, and for a handful of millions that would shape a century, he'd backstopped the purchase that doubled the nation. The Louisiana Treaty was not the triumph of a single genius. It was the opportunism of a government willing to spend for strategic distance. Monroe was good at this kind of opportunism because he understood scale, the way rivers can be policy and maps can be arguments won without guns. In London, he tried for a better peace than British practice would allow. Monroe Pinckney produced provisions sensible in a vacuum and indigestible in the atmosphere of Jefferson's hopes and the country's pride. He accepted the refusal without melodrama and returned to the work of sustaining relationships that did not flatter him. When Madison needed steadiness, he asked Monroe to serve as Secretary of State in a season when foreign affairs meant holding the nation's dignity together, while larger powers treated American commerce like a cupboard to be raided whenever dinner ran short. As war pressed on the horizon, Monroe became the officer every cabinet hopes to have once, the one who can change desks without changing tone. During the war's worst week, with the capital under threat from a professional army that moved with British patience, Monroe took on the War Department in addition to state, trying to make order out of requisitions and roads and militia that liked to be home by supper. At Bladensburg, he rode the field among confusion not of his sole making and watched discipline crack. At Washington, he supervised what could be saved, sent Dolly Madison's household into that last minute of frantic choice that turns into folklore, and then did the unromantic work after the flames, rescue the forms, reestablish correspondence, restore the schedule. He did not posture as a warrior. He never forgot what battle can do. He was a surgeon of continuity. That apprenticeship delivered him to the presidency with a reputation for competence rather than brilliance and a style that confused superficial readers into calling him dull. He did not mind the slight. He had watched brilliant men overspend the Republic's patience. He preferred to look like the last grown-up in the room. The election of 1816 placed him in the chair with the Federalist Party collapsing into bitterness and the Jefferson-Madison coalition dissolving into factions that were more geography than creed. This was the famous era of good feelings, which was neither unbroken concord nor a pastel dawn. It was a ceasefire orchestrated by a man who mixed courtesy with calculation, traveled more than any president yet could touch the country with the hand of the executive rather than the echo of a proclamation, and staffed his government as if balance were a discipline and not a pose. John Quincy Adams at State, William H. Crawford at Treasury, John C. Calhoun at War, William Wirt as Attorney General, a cabinet that could be a quarrel if mismanaged and a set of instruments if tuned. Monroe tuned them by giving them work and insisting that they write their results in complete sentences. His foreign policy was a sonata in 3 movements: peace with Britain structured into habit, clarity with Spain translated into a border, and respect for Latin American revolutions turned into a sentence that would outlive him. The Rush-Bagot Agreement throttled down the naval heat on the Great Lakes, and the Convention of 1818 corrected maps that rumor and hope had drawn. Boundary at the 49th parallel to the Rockies, joint occupation in the Oregon country to avoid a premature quarrel in a space not yet ready to be governed by law. It was a style, quiet instruments, a minimum of adjectives, the knowledge that 2 nations which had burned each other's capitals within living memory could behave like neighbors if they remembered that the alternative to a rule is a raid. Spain proved a harder interlocutor because it combined pride with fatigue. Florida was a hinge on which too many doors swung. Fugitive enslaved people sought its refuge. Creek refugees and Seminoles crossed its lines and found in the swamps a negation of tidy treaties. American settlers treated the border as an invitation and then wrote to Congress insisting that order be made out of their disobedience. Then came Jackson, with his habit of turning muddy roads into orders of the day. His movement into Florida produced victories, outrages, and facts. On the ground, hanging 2 British subjects, occupying Spanish posts, sending Monroe a dispatch that read like a dare. Monroe carried the weight to his desk and did not panic. He let John Quincy Adams write the long letter to Spain that converted embarrassment into leverage, listing injuries with prosecutorial coolness, and offering a bargain that would make the chaos into a treaty. Adams' honest gave the United States Florida, drew the Sabine, Red, and Arkansas as the border to the Pacific, and surrendered the American claim to Texas, on paper. It settled a quarrel by choosing a future shape. Monroe had managed the scandal of an unauthorized general by making it a preface to law. If those achievements sound like the work of a competent clerk elevated beyond his poetry, the sentence he allowed to be written in his name supplies the poetry. In 1823, as the crowned heads of Europe composed grand alliances against the oxygen of revolution, and as Britain's George Canning dangled the notion of a joint declaration against further colonization in the Americas, Monroe chose the independence of an independent voice. He listened to Jefferson's counsels about hemispheric character and to Madison's cautions about overpromising, and then he took the advice of his Secretary of State, whose nerve in this moment gave the doctrine its spine: declare, without bluster and without apology, that the Western Hemisphere is no longer a field for European colonization, that the political systems of the 2 hemispheres are essentially different and ought not to be mixed, that the United States will not interfere in Europe's internal wars, and expects Europe not to interfere in the destinies of states on this side of the ocean. The doctrine did not turn the American Navy into a trident. It turned American policy into a principle. It relied in its first decade on British sea power as a fact of life, and on American resolve as a statement of self-respect. The combination worked because the doctrine was not a threat. It was a line drawn in the mind, first and eventually on maps. It taught the United States to speak of itself as a guardian without pretending to be a jailer. Beneath those clean victories lay an economy like a man who has worked himself into an illness he refuses to name. The Panic of 1819 announced itself without clarinet, credit expanding in the afterglow of victory, land prices growing as if arithmetic were a mood, state banks issuing promises as if ink were collateral, and then the Second Bank of the United States contracting credit with a violence that turned paper into scorn. Farmers discovered that crops cannot pay mortgages whose numbers were written in euphoria. Small merchants discovered that optimism is not a letter of credit. Debtors' prisons filled with men who had believed themselves sober. Monroe did not prescribe alchemy. He could not. He lacked both the tools and the philosophy to tell the economy to become fair by edict. He encouraged state-level relief where constitutions would bear it, urged the bank to moderate, and refused to cut the government's word into smaller pieces to make it easier to swallow. He did not indulge in scapegoats, an omission for which he was not thanked. He accepted that the mood of good feeling cannot survive a foreclosed farm and a shuttered shop. He kept his head and kept the republic from turning a financial convulsion into a constitutional spasm. Then came Missouri, and the era lost its epithet. When the Trans-Mississippi Territory petitioned for statehood with slavery as part of its ordinary law, the House discovered a conscience it had avoided, and the nation discovered that the line between compromise and surrender looks different depending on whether you read it from a plantation or from a conscience trained in a northern pulpit. The Talmadge Amendments pressed for gradual emancipation. Southern members heard in the words a prelude to demographic strangulation and political eclipse. Westerners heard an attack on settlement. The galleries heard a sudden honesty. Monroe did not lecture the chamber. He allowed Henry Clay's skills to earn their reputation. He signaled acceptance of a boundary that would buy time, Maine free, Missouri slave, and a line at 36 degrees 30. Across the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase, forbidding slavery north of it, with exceptions for what already was. He signed the measure that became the Missouri Compromise, not because it fed his own peace, but because it kept the Union from finding out in that year whether it could kill itself over an arithmetic of human bondage. He suspected, like Madison, that time might weaken the institution, you shorten the fuse. He may have hoped too much. He did not pretend that hope is policy. He did the arithmetic of survival and let the grandchildren judge. That judgment cannot be rendered without measuring his own entanglements. Monroe owned enslaved people, for whom he sometimes arranged sale, sometimes arranged discipline, sometimes arranged manumission, his conscience a ledger that never cleared. He made a project of colonization, helping to found the American Colonization Society in the belief that one pathway out of slavery's political and moral trap might be the resettlement of free black people to Africa. The colony that bore his name, Monrovia, was a gesture both generous and evasive. Generous because he wanted lives outside the reach of white malice, evasive because he did not think his society could become quickly just without becoming suddenly dangerous. The movement would grow, confer respectability on an answer that satisfied neither justice nor power, and leave the deeper wound untouched. Like Jefferson, like Madison, like too many of their class, he managed the contradiction rather than curing it. Monroe's management of domestic development carried the stamp of a man raised by Jefferson and tempered by war. He loved the idea of roads and canals as arteries of union and commerce. He distrusted the constitutional convenience that would let Congress build whatever it wished, wherever it wished, without a warrant from the text. In 1822, he returned the Cumberland Road Bill with a message that will forever please and annoy those who want their presidents to be instructors rather than improvisers. He argued that Congress could appropriate money for internal improvements because the spending power can travel where enumerated powers cannot. He denied that Congress could exercise jurisdiction or undertake construction without a constitutional amendment. It was a distinction narrow enough to infuriate nationalists and elegant enough to make lawyers sigh with pleasure. He published, shortly thereafter, a long Views on the Subject of Internal Improvements, which read like a man trying to plant stakes in a river. He did not entirely succeed, but his honesty about the limits he believed the charter imposed prevented the creeping annexation of power by practice. He invited the country to amend if it wished to do more. The country preferred the ambiguity future courts would refine. He accepted the verdict without sulking. He traveled like a president who believed presence is policy. His tours in 1817 and 1819 were not pageantry. They were diagnostic visits to a republic still introducing itself to its parts. He rode roads that taught him how far the capital sentences have to travel to become law. He heard in town halls the timbre of contentment and complaint. He wore the uniform coat on occasion, not because he longed to be revered as a general, but because he wanted veterans and farmers to know the executive remembered what a bayonet looks like. The press named the mood after the feeling, and the feeling after the man. He disliked the spotlight. He did not hide from it. He shook hands in a way that made distance feel like dignity, rather than aloofness. He believed that a president should embody the Union as much by absence of grievance as by presence of program. His respect for the judiciary was not idolatry, but a civilized instinct for limits. The court under Marshall carved into the granite of law decisions that would make national power legible and private contracts secure. McCulloch, Dartmouth College, Gibbons. Monroe did not treat the court as a rival or a servant. He treated it as an organ doing its work. He appointed justices without trying to turn the bench into a party instrument and let opinions that strengthened federal reach coexist with his own caution about enumerated powers, because he read the difference between adjudication and administration as the difference between grammar and composition. He wanted the grammar clear so that the composition could be graceful. He governed a War Department that repaired itself, a Navy that learned to be useful without theatrics, and an executive mansion that was being rebuilt out of ashes into a symbol that would resist the temptation to look like a palace. He lived simply and left entertainments to a wife whose social genius made Washington hospitable without turning it into a court. Elizabeth's salons did not flatter, they civilized. She wore the new capital as if it were a responsibility. Monroe appreciated the pressure and did not pretend to be at ease. He never learned to love performance. He learned to endure expectation. The election of 1820 registered as an exercise in unanimity. Only a single elector withheld the pretense of perfection to preserve Washington's unique place. The country was less unified than the tally. Monroe could feel the factional winds inside his cabinet. Adams's austere excellence, Crawford's machine of friends and favors, Calhoun's glittering ambition. He let them compete, as if the chair were training ground for the transition he would not control. He wanted to be the last of a line, not the architect of a dynasty's extension. He allowed the King caucus to collapse on its own dead weight. He did not bless a successor because he believed the great office should travel through the test of consent rather than the transfer of approval. In this, as in so much else, he behaved as if dignity and modesty were one thing. He left office poorer than a grateful people should have allowed. Like Washington and Jefferson, he had land rich and cash poor. Unlike Hamilton, he had no taste for markets beyond the arithmetic of the farm. Creditors found him patient and then found him tired. He wrote to legislatures and friends without begging. He received help without vanity. He moved between the homes of his daughters like a father who understood that devotion is a kind of currency men forget to name. He visited the University of Virginia like a man who had invested in a temple and hoped it would outlast the worshippers' moods. He wrote with restraint and died on the 4th of July, as if the century had decided to close a ledger with a flourish it did not need. The symmetry delighted a country that loves coincidence. The work behind it still matters more. Judging him requires a temperament he himself admired, slow to accuse genius where competence did the job, slow to forgive failure where structure could have prevented it. He did not invent credit, he preserved it. He did not discover a continent, he bought the right to reach for it, without foreign diplomacy becoming cartography. He did not organize a national conscience. He kept it from tearing the country before it could teach itself. He let John Quincy Adams write brilliant letters and then made those letters into standing policy. He let Henry Clay resolve with rhetoric, and then gave the compromises a signature that made them law. He let Jackson's violence become leverage, and then restrained it with a treaty that looked like the result of planning, rather than of accident. He balanced the needs of a broad republic with the limits of a narrow charter, sometimes to the annoyance of men who preferred bold lines to careful distinctions. He believed the job of the president was not to dazzle, but to endure. The Monroe Doctrine, lifted out of its decade and made into a banner for later adventures, is easy to misuse. It is harder to imitate. Its original tone was neither boast nor bludgeon. It was a warning pitched as a proposition. Separate spheres to reduce collisions. Non-colonization as a premise rather than a threat. American abstention from Europe's hereditary quarrels as an ethical and practical choice. European abstention from hemispheric republican experiments as the condition of decent relations. Adams gave the words their steel. Monroe gave them their legitimacy. The British fleet gave them their early enforceability. Together they made something rare, a principle that improved with time because later generations could add muscle without adding arrogance. It is fashionable to sneer at the doctrine as cover for future dominion. Monroe did not write it as conquest. He wrote it as self-respect. His failures are not trivial footnotes. The panic scarred lives and taught him only the modest lesson that officers can govern mood by example and law by steadiness while leaving capital to educate itself. Missouri taught him the limit of good feelings as a solvent for human bondage. His signature kept peace and postponed justice. Internal improvements taught him the awkwardness of a constitution that supplies desire with phrases and then demands patience while amendment catches up. Colonization taught him the comfort of an answer that offloads a difficulty onto geography. In each case, he took the path that preserved the frame, while trusting or hoping that the frame would help produce a future capable of better choices. Sometimes frames do that. Sometimes they preserve the unpreservable. He accepted those risks and their indictments and kept governing as if the country could be taught to grow into its ideals. There's a moment near the end of his first tour that fixes the measure of the man. He stands on a bluff above a river whose name his generation is still learning to pronounce politely. Citizens have gathered to look at a president the newspapers have trained them to expect will smile less than he listens. He thanks the town. He mentions the road behind him without making a complaint of its ruts. He praises the malicious turnout without making a theater of martial pride. He talks about canals as if they were moral instruments and schools as if they were forts. He avoids the temptation to flatter the crowd into believing their state deserves more than its neighbors. He ends early. He meets hands. He sleeps in an ordinary bed. He leaves before breakfast because the schedule says so. That is the style that preserved his decade. Do the necessary thing without turning the necessary into the dramatic. The Virginia dynasty ends with him, and with it the strange comfort of a republic that believed its executive should move through the world like a gentleman on a walk, courteous, resolved, more likely to persuade than to command. The republic would next enter a period where command, noise, and energy would dominate. The continuity between those periods is the achievement of Monroe. He made it possible for democracy, boisterous and hungry, to inherit a house whose timbers had been seasoned by restraint. He did not hammer his name into the lintel. He did not need it there. The map carries him. The doctrine carries him. The line at the 49th carries him. The line at 36 degrees 30 minutes carries him. The quiet realism about Britain carries him. The sentence about Europe carries him. The rest is the record of a temperament that believed in schedules more than in spectacles. If you want to keep him honest and generous at once, you do not call him genius or saint. You call him what the moment required and what he supplied. A statesman who could turn force into leverage, leverage into treaty, treaty into peace, peace into habit. You note the wound from Trenton and the steady pen beneath a doctrine that would protect men in places he would never see. You praise the tour that made a continent feel less like a rumor of regions and more like a country keeping an appointment with itself. You do not spare him the charge of having signed a compromise that wrote slavery into geography one more time. You do not spare him the admission that he left office poorer than the country he had made richer. You remember that he looked at Tower without falling in love. You remember that he left when it was time. He lived long enough to see the quarrels he had muted begin again under other names, which is to say he lived just long enough to learn that good government is not a cure but a craft. He practiced that craft with a soldier's memory and a lawyer's caution, with a planter's contradictions and a patriot's endurance, with a husband's reliance on a wife who understood that public life must be made hospitable to be bearable, with a friend's loyalty to men whose gifts were not his own and whose excesses he restrained by patience more than by scolding. He leaves behind not a dramatic chapter, but a sturdy one. In politics, the latter is rarer and more welcome. You may look for his statue and find it smaller than you expected. That is fitting. His monument is a sentence every schoolchild paraphrases, a boundary that does not quarrel with the mountains it crosses, a capital rebuilt without troubling to look like a palace, a cabinet that thought in paragraphs, a road vetoed for reasons that still make arguments honest. A crisis of money endured without finding a tyrant to blame, a compromise signed with a hand that knew its cost and decided that for that year the union was worth the price. He was not the brightest light, he was the lamp that stays lit. The Republic is lucky in men who can invent. It is safe in men who can maintain. James Monroe maintained.